This is the end of this long and important chapter in which you learned a lot of new things. So before moving on to the next chapter, I think it's a good idea to take some time to take a look at what has been covered in this chapter. In this chapter, you learned about relational databases. You learned about tables, fields, records, primary keys, and foreign keys. These are very important concepts to grasp, but of course, databases is a much wider topic, and you learn just the basics in this chapter. You also defined a data source in the ColdFusion administrator, and you learned how ColdFusion handles the differences between the database engines of different vendors. You also learned the basics of a very important tag, which is the CF query tag that you use to send SQL statements to a database. You learn some more CF output tricks, and you learn some additional ColdFusion functions. Regarding the CF query, you learned some attributes. The data source attribute that you use to specify to which database you want to send the SQL statement. The name attribute to specify the name of a variable that stores the result of the query, what comes back from the database, and the result attribute that creates another variable that stores the metadata of that query. You also learned the basics of SQL. SQL is the structured query language that you use to query the database, and you learned some SQL statement like the select statement, the from, the where, the order by, the as, and also the year function. Remember that this function is performed by the database, not by ColdFusion. ColdFusion just sends that statement in the database, but it is the database that executes it. You also learned about dynamic queries, and that is adding CFML code in the SQL statement. We did that, remember, with the now function. So each time we run the query is a little bit different because the data that comes back from the now function is a little bit different each time. Regarding the CF output, you learned the query attribute to make the CF output loop over a query, and the group attribute to group data together. Remember the news sidebar with the years, we had to group things together. Regarding the ColdFusion functions, you learned about the date format function that takes two arguments, the date to format, and an optional mask. It is optional, so it is written here in square brackets. Remember in the ColdFusion documentation, what is in square brackets is optional. You also learned the month function very briefly. Be aware that there is also a day function and a year function, of course. And you learned the now function that returns the timestamp of now, which means today's date, and now time. This makes a lot of things. I hope you enjoyed this chapter and that you're getting excited by the huge capabilities of ColdFusion. In the next chapter, we will build on top of that new knowledge and build a drill down interface.